Good afternoon, everyone. I've only been given 10 minutes or thereabouts, so I'm going to have to tackle this huge subject, challenges facing the new government, fairly briefly. But anyway, let me do my best. I think that when we were all here last September for the SSSUK Annual Symposium, I doubt if any of us could really have forecast the situation that Sudan would find itself in today. And Sudan's pro-democracy movement has really achieved a great victory by getting the military council to agree to a sort of hybrid transitional government. The goals of the revolution, freedom, peace and justice, have not yet been achieved, but I think the formation of the transitional government and the documents on which that is based have laid the foundations for trying to achieve them, and have at least given us a path forward. Now, as we know, the challenges facing Abdallah Hamdok, the new Prime Minister, and his cabinet team are absolutely huge. After 30 years of the Bashir regime, the country is in a critical state, with the economy on its knees, pervasive corruption, weak and politicised state institutions, multiple unaccountable armies and militias, members of the deep state controlling key sectors of the economy, the civil service and the military security apparatus, public assets and large tracts of Sudan's land sold off, a large displaced population, millions of whom are still living in camps with their land occupied by new settlers, health and education, the health and education systems in tatters, as we heard this morning, extreme inequalities between a privileged elite and the mass of the population who are impoverished, gender inequality, lack of opportunities for youth. The list is endless. And as one speaker said this morning, the degree of destruction by the former regime is beyond belief. The 16 tasks for the transitional government, which are set out in the Constitutional Declaration, look pretty formidable, ranging from achieving a comprehensive and just peace in the next 6 months, to resolving the economic crisis, rebuilding the war-affected areas, ensuring justice and accountability, reforming the public sector, repealing restrictive laws, drafting a permanent national constitution and holding a national constitutional conference. This is a massive agenda for any government, especially when you consider the constraints it faces. Firstly, the new government has only got 3 years and 3 months. This is an incredibly short period in which to drive through change, particularly as at the end of that there are supposed to be free and fair elections. Secondly, the civil service is full of many people who were appointed over the last 30 years on the basis of ideology or loyalty to the regime, regardless of their qualifications or lack of them. At a minimum, one could say that most of these people are going to be risk-averse. So the new technocratic ministers are likely to find themselves quite isolated in their new departments, without a cadre of competent officials able and willing to deliver reform. Thirdly, security sector reform has been left to the military institutions. The government needs to significantly cut the defence budget, which eats up over 70% of government spending. But imposing cuts on the generals, or doing anything to touch the Rapid Support Force or its business empire, is likely to be a perilous undertaking. Although there is a civilian majority in the Sovereign Council, in the event that there is no consensus, decisions require a 2/3 majority, so that means the military can block decisions that they don't like. Fourthly, there is still social polarisation, born of anger in the conflict areas at historic and continuing marginalisation, and also at the fact that many people in Khartoum kept silent about their suffering for years and years. Fifthly, there is very strong public pressure for justice and accountability for all the victims of the crimes of the previous regime since 1989, and of course for the martyrs of the December Revolution, and particularly the 3rd of June massacre. But although there is an agreement to set up an independent investigation committee, justice and accountability could be constrained in the short term by the fragile power-sharing deal. And then finally, and potentially the most daunting of all, the new government has no money. Abdullah Hamdok has said that Sudan needs $8 billion over the next 2 years to cover its import bill, and a further $2 billion of foreign exchange to deposit in the central bank over the next 3 months to halt the continuing fall in the currency. These are huge sums of money which, my impression is, Western governments are unlikely to be able to provide in the short term. There are legal and technical obstacles, including Sudan's debt arrears and the US designation of Sudan as a state sponsor of terrorism, that will have to be addressed before any major packages of financial assistance from the international financial institutions will be possible. I think that Western governments and the World Bank and the IMF are more than ready to look at how these things can be addressed as quickly as possible. But in the short term, the Gulf states may be called upon to help, ideally as part of a coordinated international plan with funds channeled through the Ministry of Finance. Many of the things that the transitional government is tasked to do require money, especially dismantling the deep state through public sector reform and security sector reform. For example, retiring and pensioning off people in the civil service who resist reform or haven't got qualifications for their jobs is hugely expensive. It would mean paying pensions to those being removed, while at the same time paying the salaries of the new qualified people. So to start with, the wage bill is likely to go up. If existing employees are simply dismissed, then there's a risk they will go out on the streets and cause public disorder. Reform measures will need to be prioritised and sequenced into short, medium and longer term actions. Some changes can be started during the transitional period, but are likely to take much more than 39 months to complete. Other changes, especially around security sector reform, are likely to be politically very sensitive. So the government will need a clear plan for managing this process and getting buy-in from international partners who are expected to help fund it. Political, economic and security reform are all interlinked. As the British ambassador has pointed out in his latest blog called Sudan's New Dawn, which I commend to you, he said Sudan's new government will need to take quick steps to show progress on peace, freedom of expression, human rights and humanitarian access if it wants to convince the world that Sudan now deserves economic assistance. So given all these constraints, managing expectations will be crucial. The Sudanese people will be impatient to see improvements in their lives, but solutions don't come quickly. So the government will need to make a constant effort to explain to the public what it is doing and why they need to be patient. Good communication and consultation will be vital. Otherwise, slow economic improvement could lead to renewed street protests, which could in turn give the military an excuse to say that the civilian government has failed, or could open the door to the risk of renewed violence on the streets by the security forces, thereby creating a negative spiral which could halt the reform process. Abdullah Hamdok and his cabinet of technocrats will also require strong political support from the forces for freedom and change if they are to have a chance of success. There are clearly still tensions and internal rivalries within the forces for freedom and change, as we've seen again during the process of Sovereign Council and cabinet formation. But now that there is a largely civilian cabinet in place, which was nominated by the Forces for Freedom and Change, I think it's important that the Forces for Freedom and Change should try their very best to unite, to provide political leadership and a clear political programme. Disunity will play into the hands of elements from the old regime who have an interest in undermining the transitional government and ensuring it fails. Despite all these challenges, which I've briefly sketched out, there are also, I think, big opportunities and reasons for hope and optimism. For me, the biggest reason for hope is, as Jill has mentioned, the courage and determination shown by the Sudanese people to keep the fire of the revolution alive until they achieve their objectives and to build a new Sudan. The best guarantee for any political agreement is not so much having international guarantors, but having broad support from the population, which is why consultation, communication and inclusion of youth, women and people from the marginalised areas is so important. Secondly, the new government offers big opportunities because for the first time in years, Sudan has a leader who commands widespread national and international respect. Abdallah Hamdok has a clear vision and priorities for Sudan based on the political programme of the Forces for Freedom and Change. He has a wealth of relevant experience and many admirable personal qualities. I had the privilege of getting to know him quite well when I worked with him earlier this year on a series of Chatham House workshops on economic reform, and I regard him with huge respect. It's encouraging that the new cabinet that he's just announced includes a number of qualified experts and people with a record of activism. It's clear that the Prime Minister has also tried very hard to achieve gender and regional inclusion while recognising that much more needs to be done in this respect. So with a competent economic team in place, there is now an opportunity to try to stabilise Sudan's economy and set the country on the path to economic recovery and development. The new government enjoys a lot of international goodwill and should be in a strong position to press for a change in the international approach to Sudan. The UK, for example, has already promised that it will offer political support and economic and technical assistance to make the reforms needed in Sudan a reality. The Prime Minister has already received an invitation to attend the UN General Assembly in 2 weeks' time, which will be his first big appearance on the international stage, and I'm sure he will make a very positive impression on world leaders. The other major priority, which is also a big challenge, is the opportunity to achieve peace, which is essential for both democratic transition and economic reform. Whereas in the past, the government and the armed movements negotiated in a confrontational posture, and there was frankly no real political will on the government side to achieve peace, this time they will be partners in the revolution. In the last few days, we've seen that Abdallah Hamdok has announced that preparations are being made to set up the Peace Commission, which will negotiate with the armed movements. Abdulaziz Al-Hilu has declared his willingness to enter into peace negotiations with the transitional government, saying that it has found recognition among the Sudanese people. And the two factions of the Sudan Revolutionary Front have agreed to unite around a joint negotiating position. Despite feeling rebuffed over their demand to play a greater role in the formation of the new government, the Sudan Revolutionary Front succeeded in getting a substantive chapter on peace included in the constitutional declaration. This was an important achievement, as otherwise this key issue might have been missing. There is still a long way to go in the peace talks, especially when the hard issues come to be addressed. But it looks as though the new government and most of the leaders of the armed movements recognise that there is now a golden opportunity to achieve peace. So in conclusion, the challenges are huge, but so are the opportunities. And I think it's up to all of us to try to get behind Abdallah Hamdok and his new team, and for the international community to come up with the best possible support as they try to move the country forward. Thank you.